Now we are here at PlayOn with Darren and Chris from Retro Games Limited, and they they now presented to us the upcoming full-size Spectrum. And as I heard, it's the first time it has been done in this quality and this form factor. And now I'm going to ask Chris primarily some questions about the upcoming release. Um, but first of all, I would like to ask Darren a question. I guess Darren, you forced the release at some time and crowned the idea. Can you tell us a bit about that, perhaps?
To be fair, the love affair with the Spectrum started when I was still at school. It was my first machine. Before my beloved C64, I had my beloved Spectrum. So my gaming history really started with the Spectrum. However, I would say the person that championed this more than anybody in the company was Chris. Chris has had a love affair with the Spectrum. It feels like your entire life, I'm sure. And where we were looking at other machines as well, Chris has been quite a vocal proponent of recreating the Spectrum and doing it in such a way that it is absolutely perfect. You know, I say this every time. I'm really, really proud of this. I think it's probably the best thing we've done yet.
Awesome.
And I know I've said that now probably about 6 times already, but I think it's the best thing we've done yet.
It was mentioned in the presentation before that you're very proud about the licenses you've got.
Yeah.
So perhaps tell us a bit about that, because I know that with the Amiga Mini, you have been a bit disappointed that it was more difficult to get good games for it.
It's always difficult when you're dealing with games that are 30, 40 years old. Tracking down IP, tracking down the ownership, and ensuring that you're doing it correctly is always difficult. With the Spectrum, we were lucky in a lot of regards, in as much as, because I've been in the games industry and Chris has been around the games industry now for so long, we knew a lot of the people who owned the IP, so we were quite lucky. Some of the games, obviously, we can only mention at this time a few of the games on the lineup. As Chris alluded to earlier on, we've got The Hobbit, which was a seminal title. Everybody certainly knew what The Hobbit was. It's not been re-released in 42 years.
Awesome.
And, you know, some of these things are quite challenging to get. Manic Miner, again, really challenging to ensure. But it was probably one of the biggest selling titles of all time on the Spectrum. We had to have it. And obviously, I'm just looking at the screen in front of me now. Head Over Heels was, again, it was probably the best isometric game ever to have been written on the Spectrum. So we are really, really proud of the lineup that we've got.
Awesome. So now let me ask some questions to Chris. Chris, you mentioned that you also support joysticks, which is interesting because most games were written to be played with the keyboard. So what did you implement to make the games that's coming with the computer to be playable for the joysticks? Because let's face it, people who had not a Spectrum before, would they really want to play it on the keyboard? So what was your thought about that technical difficulty? Did you reprogram the games in a way, or what did you do?
Well, it actually ends up being a lot simpler than you'd first expect. The challenges are actually mapping each game to the controller in a consistent way, because all the developers, most of them were like bedroom developers, and they just did things their way. They didn't necessarily do them the same way every time they did a game. So there's a bit of consistency, but not a lot. Spectrum users could buy third-party joystick interfaces. So a lot of the games would allow you to say, "Oh, I've got a Kempston joystick," or "I've got a Cursor joystick." But these joysticks only had up, down, left, right, and fire. But sometimes these games needed you to select some keys as well for a menu. So what we had to do is allow different types of joystick interface to be used, but also allow we mapped the additional keys to a modern game controller. So you've got A, B, X, Y, the shoulder buttons, and that sort of thing, really. Predominantly, like you can see on there, predominantly all the controls are already listed as for a keyboard, but also there is the joystick mapping that we've done as well for that. You know, so yeah, we've married the two together. There's some small inconsistencies, but on the whole, the team's done a really good job in doing that mapping.
And you also mentioned, interestingly, that despite it only mentions, it only looks like one model actually. You emulate all models, including the 128K model. So, but you didn't do that with early releases like the Amiga Mini. What was the decision to say we will release all models? Is it because you have a wider range of compatibility with bringing your own games, or is it because of the licensed titles, or what was the decision behind that? I mean, it's making things more complicated in the end, right? To differentiate between all the different models.
Well, essentially, in the 10 years of life of the Spectrum, 1982, 1983, 1994, but it was only the first 4 years or so of the Spectrum's life where it was just the 48K version. For the remaining 6 years, it was the more advanced model, which had just more memory and a bigger sound chip. There were some complications. They redesigned the circuit and changed some of the timing later on in its life, at the end of the 80s, which we've had to deal with. But in essence, there's not very much difference between the two models other than a sound chip and more memory. So it was an obvious academic choice to do it, really. It's a lot more complicated with the Amiga because of the different chipsets, the ECS, OCS, ACA, and all that, OJ, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot simpler to do in the Spectrum, but still challenging in a different way.
Awesome. You also mentioned in your presentation that it's 100% NTSC PAL compatible, which is interesting because most people would say the ZX Spectrum was mainly in Great Britain, UK, a big hit. So, is there some special emphasis on the NTSC compatibility? Do you have some American imported titles that you put in? If you even are allowed to talk about that, I don't know, because you said some titles are still yet unrevealed, but it really interests me why you put so much emphasis on the American compatibility on a British home computer.
It's quite simple, really. We're a global company, and there are expats who now live in the United States. There are people in the United States who would have loved to have a Spectrum. You know, they've heard about it and they can't get one because they only work on old TVs, and they certainly wouldn't support 50 hertz. And also there are people who use like gaming monitors, and they use that across all of their range of things, and they often don't support 50 hertz either. So for us to have a 60 hertz compatibility, it's a no-brainer decision. It comes with some technical complexity because we have to ensure that the games will still run at, the emulation itself and all the games run at 50 frames, but the output of the HDMI runs at 60. The advantage with the Spectrum was that you rarely got games that actually updated the screen more than 20 times a second, let alone 50 times a second. So you don't notice any frame drop or any frame synchronization, etc. They run pretty much as smoothly at 60 hertz as they do on 50. But we recommend that if you've got a 50 hertz television mode, you use that because that is going to guarantee the absolute best experience.
Now you said you have been lucky on some cases with designing the product and the compatibility. What was actually the hardest challenge? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the hardest challenge, well, Sinclair was all about cost, the biggest cost price. So the rubber keys, everything was all done to reduce cost, to make it simple to manufacture. Wind forward 42 years, and all of our manufacturing partners had a really hard time trying to reproduce what should be a simple thing. You know, a part of the argument was they did this 40 years ago, why is it now hard? And it's because they are having to bring in several technologies. The metal keyboard plate, the rubber, and the plastics. And the processes they used back in the day to produce all of these don't exist now. They're more automated processes, and they've got different techniques for producing, like the rubber keyboard mat. And that changed the feel of the keyboard, which we couldn't have. So we almost had to reverse engineer the process to get to a point where they were able to consistently reproduce the keyboard feel on a mass-produced basis. So you wouldn't have thought that would have been the more complicated part, but it was. I was sitting in a Zoom meeting with the guys out in China, and about an hour into the meeting, I said, "I'll be on a plane tomorrow." And so I was out in China the next day, literally, to help them sort this out, because you can't explain to people how it's supposed to feel. They've got some old ZX Spectrums in the factory, but they're old and they don't feel like they should feel. You know, they're worn. Just bought on eBay. You know, so being in the room with them and teaching them what the retro feel actually is challenging. So there.
So can we talk about when you plan to release the machine? And where can people get it from? Are there any special distribution partners? Is it just Amazon and the likes? Can we talk about the release plan?
Yeah, sure. So the announced date will be the 27th of August, which I know you know about, and it'll be on increasing general sale through the main retail vendors that you find for all these kind of retro products, really. And it will be being shipped to the customers by the retail on the 22nd of November. So that is the day it hits the shelves, basically.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for your time and answering the questions. Very much looking forward to it. Thanks for your time.